Hello again, and welcome to Session 3 of the 2017 FBR Ops Series. Our discussion today is on the top 3 legal issues affecting franchisee support. We have 2 panelists today that I'm sure many of you recognize, Lane Fisher, a partner at Fisher Zucker, and Brian Schnell, partner and chair of franchise practice at Faegre Baker Daniels. Thank you both for taking some time out of your day for us. And I'm going to go ahead and turn this conversation over to FBR CEO Eric Stites to begin our conversation.
Thank you, Mike. Welcome back, everybody. I know that today's session is of great interest to a lot of people, and we're going to try and cover as much as we can. We've got 2 of the greatest legal minds in franchising, in my opinion, and in many people's opinion on the call today. So please take advantage of the 90 minutes that we have to pick their brains and get their opinions. And I will kind of put a caveat out there that Lane and Brian may not always agree on an issue, and you'll find that when you talk to different attorneys, there's lots of different opinions out there. So I think the more opinions you get, the better decision you can make. So what I want to do is, in Lane,
Eric, our individual opinions change from week to week. So
that's true. So why don't I have Lane just give a little bit of background about your career in both the franchise and legal world.
Well, Eric, it all began when I went to McDonald's as a partner. Thanks for the opportunity, and I appreciate the opportunity to be a panel here, and hi, everybody on the call. My name is Lane Fisher. I'm a principal in a practice called Fisher Zucker, headquartered here in Philadelphia with offices also in New Jersey. We have a 12-lawyer practice group, which I guess as a monumental feat just completed the updating and registration work for more than 180 different brands as we finished April 30th. I am a member of the IFA Board of Directors, serving my second term. I was the chair of membership for 3 years, the chair of the Legal Symposium for 3, and currently the chair of the FranPac Advisory Board. But as Eric, this is all that we do. I'm not sure there's an answer to all these questions, but we'll certainly share with you the wisdom that we are sharing with our clients and that and they're sharing with us.
Great. Thanks, Lane. And Brian, how about a little background on you as well?
Yeah, thanks, Eric. Like Lane, been very active in the industry, including the International Franchise Association. This will be my 30th year, and I tell folks that every single day of my professional life has been in franchising. My very first project as a lawyer was for International Dairy Queen. And so been in it, as I mentioned, for 30 years, and really enjoy all the complexities and nuances of franchising. And Lane and I approach the issues and topics like this in a similar fashion, in that there's a legal component to it, but it's often just a component. And the kind of challenging, interesting thing of franchising is how do franchisors navigate through the challenges and opportunities, understanding the legal pressure points, but then all the other pressure points that factor into growing, protecting, evolving a franchise system with all the different stakeholders in a franchise system, which obviously includes the franchisor, but also the franchisees and the brand customers. So again, I think that's what we're going to talk about today, is navigating through these challenges and opportunities with the handful of issues that are facing franchising today.
Yeah, no, there's certainly a lot. And, I want to guide the conversation really to focus on 3 main areas. One, I kind of group into what I consider franchisee life cycle issues. And, it starts with onboarding. We get into performance and compliance related issues, and then we get into legacy issues. And actually, that's really, both on the franchisor side as well as on the franchisee side. And then kind of wrapped in the middle there is a lot of issues around HR, which tend to be more and more prevalent today, and we'll talk a lot about some of those issues. And then third, I want to kind of talk and have you guys talk about some of the regulatory issues that are out there and those external pressures that are put on all our franchise systems that we have little control over and have to adjust to on a daily basis. So to start, what I want to do is I want to lead off with a poll question just to get a sense from the audience about how many have legal counsel in-house versus using external attorneys only. So we got that question up there. And Brian, I'll actually ask you the question. When in dealing with your clients, at what point do you typically see a franchisor adding an in-house counsel to the equation?
I think it depends on the executive team and what type of talent and experience exists at the executive level. And then candidly, it's for an emerging or middle-sized franchisor, it depends on the CEO and COO's experience and relationship with lawyers. I think Lane and I serve as, in effect, the outside general counsel for a lot of franchisors, and that's because of the relationship and experience that we've established and the like. So to me, Eric, there's not a bright line test, but it depends on, for example, if a franchisor also has a significant number of company locations where they likely are going to have more real estate needs, they're likely going to have more direct employees, then it's more likely that they'll have somebody serve in that general counsel or vice president of a legal role. If it's a pure franchise concept, there are a lot of franchisors of significant size that don't have an in-house lawyer, but they've established a relationship with somebody like Lane, like me, like a handful of others that really serve in that role.
Right. Lane, is that similar to what you find?
Yeah, I would mirror Brian's comments. I think that it does depend on what skill set you have in-house. I would say this, though. I think most emerging brands, outsource is sort of the key to everything, and I think legal fees are no exception. So I think as franchisors approach royalty self-sufficiency, we typically see them outsource. That's not an absolute rule. There are companies, obviously, it depends on what your sales volumes are and what your what your expectations are. But I would say, I would make this observation. I would have said with size comes internal legal capacity, and also especially, as Brian says, with additional company units. But I'll make the observation that the market being as liquid as it is, and private equity being as prevalent a player in terms of as buyers go, our personal observation here is that private equity is, in many cases, disbanding the internal department and outsourcing it. Just as, I don't know, Brian, if you see it the same way, but that's sort of how we see it here.
Right. So, I mean, what we talk a lot about at FBR when we work with our clients and look at the survey results is, satisfaction is all about meeting a franchisee's expectations, or, more specifically, setting expectations correctly out of the gate. And so when we're starting with onboarding, from the legal perspective, what advice do you give to your clients as far as, doing that onboarding better or the right way in order to avoid problems down the road? And Lane, why don't we start off with you?
Thanks. All right, so I think it starts with training. I mean, if I had to pick one major thing, and organizing processes that help walk people through the onboarding process, if you will. So that identifies functions and critical dates and manages those so that, frankly, a franchisee's expectations are met, and you can then set them when you meet them. That's so to end up where you started. Satisfaction is a function of meeting expectations, and so we like to lay everything out, offer high-quality training, offer a variety of manuals, not only just perhaps either a brand standards or operating manual, but also a pre-opening manual, a real estate manual, if there are other things that are tools that the franchisee can use, and that has them relying on their own self-sufficiency rather than calling you and asking you immediately the question of when you're going to come do something with respect to their location. I also think that, building expectations with respect to item 19, how the businesses might ultimately perform, and then also as to the role of internal, let's say, support or HR people, which I know we're going to get into later, in terms of what their role or function is, so that people have an understanding of who their go-to people are for what issues.
Right, right. Brian, what would you add to that?
I would add the following, Eric, and the larger topic, or one of the larger topics we're going to talk about today, is joint employment, and then its variations, which it's all around the controls. And so the argument is that if franchisors have too much control over the day-to-day operations of the business or other aspects of the business, that might mean that they should be considered joint employers, or some type of, the term we'll use later, is vicarious liability. And that is all about, in many respects, field support and operations. I for years have said the hardest job in franchising is the role of the field consultant, because they're in there every single day working with franchise owners. And so how that ties into onboarding and setting the right expectations, in my view, is as follows. In some respects, right from the get-go, we create mismanaged or unrealistic expectations, oftentimes with emerging franchisors. If you go to the International Franchise Expo next month and walk around the exhibit hall, how many times are we going to hear, "We got it all figured out. The system works. Work the system. This is plug and play. Just follow the playbook that we give you." And so, the operations people know full well.
And that doesn't even cover the illegal earnings claims that are all over the place.
Right? So it's right from the get-go how we have these unrealistic expectations. And so I often talk about what we should do, and this is consistent with what Lane said. I think it's crucial right from the get-go for everybody, franchisor and franchisee. What's the role of the franchisor, and what's the role of the franchisee? And it's the franchisee's business. And where's the franchisor going to provide support and tools and will be there to help them? But ultimately, it's still their job, their business, and when the you-know-what hits the fan, they're going to have to roll up their sleeves and figure it out with our support, rather than when it hits the fan, they say, "What, franchisor, you told me this or you told me that, and so you tell me what to do now, or you fix this or you fix that." And so right from the get-go, it goes back to the point Lane was making. It is crucial to set the right expectations, and that takes the whole franchisor organization, not just the ops people, not just the training people, but the development people. It comes from the top. And again, you don't have to lead with that. That's not the first conversation maybe in the development process, but it better be a conversation in that process.
Right. Yeah, and to use your term, it's gonna hit the fan at some point. So,
well, because that's business, right? There's no guarantees. This isn't easy, but business isn't. And so again, it's framing that appropriately right from the get-go that I think is crucial.
Right. So Lane, I think one of the toughest things, franchisors face is that balance. If you go through the process of onboarding a franchisee and you do it in the right way, and they get off the ground relatively quickly, and the business is running. I mean, obviously, they're going to run into challenges, at some point, and balancing that whole carrot versus stick approach in support, and how do you kind of lead franchisees along, and those that are a little bit slower to come along, gently pound them with the stick, and and where do the legal issues, I guess, wrap around that? I don't know what kind of best practices you see in that area.
Okay, so first let me jump in. Let me distinguish between performance issues and compliance issues because I think they're very different. Because you can have a totally compliant franchisee that performs poorly as against your metrics, and that has a million ramifications for you, beginning with the poor performance of this individual's business, but also in the item 19 when you're trying to assimilate all this information, it creates these outliers that get difficult to explain. So we've seen a lot of our clients, and I know Brian knows some of these folks too, that have like renamed a lot of their support folks that are on the street as like directors of unit level economics, something that ties them directly to franchisee profitability, and really with a fair amount of success. In other words, instead of somebody thinking the policeman's coming to come, grade you poorly on something, they think that somebody's coming to help them either improve or rehabilitate their financials. And what our folks report to us is that those franchisees turn up at those meetings remarkably well prepared with all their bank statements and deposits and whatever you'd ask them to prepare. So I think there's that triage that's sort of just on the support side of trying to help good franchisees be better. You still got to fight against that, the bottom 5% drawing 90% of your resources. And so the best practice is, of course, to try to apply your support resources to try to help your good folks become great and great folks become greater than great. And that, I think, is the first wave. If somebody performs poorly but is compliant, there may be some other contractual issue, but if they're otherwise compliant with the contract, that sort of answers the question of whether you could move them on. You could also, frankly, if it can't be fixed or it can't be fixed with that operator, many folks would have a well thought out and well choreographed resale program so that somebody who can't be taught to walk the walk might have an opportunity to exit with honor, and their business is worth what it's worth, but there's a means or path for them to exit for you to re-up to somebody better. On the compliance side, so that's really more the carrot and the stick analysis. Sometimes people are non-compliant but don't even know why they're non-compliant or that they are, and so again, it's a function of building expectations, and satisfaction is, in our world, dependent on the relationship and notice and lots of, and some deference back and forth to who the parties are. And those relationships are going to require you to try to exhaust peaceful means first. I think that, one thing that, as you approach the stick, you're going to take the default notice out or go try to terminate somebody. We always like to have lots of paper, lots of opportunity for somebody to try to cure things which are curable, not things which are, that selling drugs out of the franchise, that's not curable. But things that are curable, payment defaults and other things, are things that people can be rehabilitated on. Sometimes they don't understand that if they breach the franchise agreement, it can be terminated and they can lose their investment and they might have liability for future royalties and those kind of things. And so a lot of it is the mileage you get out of talking through the options without ever pulling your big stick out. Once you pull your big stick out, you've sort of, I guess, have come to terms with it. That person is likely going to be a problem in validation that you can deal with in one way or another. But I think that the answer is in compliance. You're always trying to lead people to where they want to go. Non-compliance could be obviously a payment default, but it could be some other failure to offer a particular service or buy a piece of equipment. And those other things, there's lots of strategies for getting folks to see the benefit and the return on these kinds of additional investments, and lots of beta testing and lots of information around those kind of things before you go create a default around it. I think will resolve the lion's share of non-compliance issues, and that leaves you with a much smaller bucket of folks who won't and don't, and then there may be, obviously you can start the default process and work through cures and lawyers. Some folks leverage an advisory council or other folks at that level to try to bring about the desired conduct, but there's a number of different strategies to try to bring folks back into compliance without bloodshed.
Yeah. No, that's a great, and it's interesting that you mentioned the advisory council, because I know a lot of our clients, or a number of our clients anyway, have set up either as part of their FAC or even a separate compliance committee, so that a lot of these compliance related issues get passed off to that committee, and kind of the stick punishment is passed out by fellow franchisees. So that, I don't know from a legal perspective, if that changes anything or not, but certainly, franchisees may not listen to their franchisor all the time, but they're much more likely to certainly listen to their fellow franchisees, and I think that kind of softens that approach, certainly. Brian, what are you seeing as far as kind of best practices as far as balancing those two positions?
Yeah, the key pieces that I would add is to me there shouldn't be a need for a lot of carrots because carrots should be, as Lane noted, unit level economics, unit level performance, and that in and of itself should drive franchise owners. You shouldn't have
hey,
to.
This is Mike. I just want to jump in for 1 second because we're getting a little bit of feedback on your line, Brian. Eric or Lane, I don't know if maybe one of you could just try going on mute. That might fix the issue. Sometimes that's the cause. Hopefully that'll get rid of it. Sorry, Brian, you can continue.
Is that better?
Yeah, that does sound better.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I think you're good.
Okay, so my point is, as Lane noted, I mean, unit level performance and achieving what the franchise owner wants to achieve should in and of itself drive performance and drive delivering on the brand promise, and they shouldn't need incentives like marketing fund support or contributions or a lower royalty or anything like that. Maybe it deals with expansion. If you want to expand and develop more locations and more units, that might be the incentive. And on the compliance piece, here's what I see. Too often, there's a lack of kind of direct transparency and communication on what's really, really important. And so if we're going to use a stick, the stick should be on mission critical standards, brand standards, payment obligations. Nothing drives franchisees crazier than feeling like they're getting nickeled and dimed. And so as a field support team and an operations team, we should be prepared to say, here's what we're going to measure. And we're going, and it's going to be around brand standards, and it's going to be living up to your financial obligations. And those are the ones we're going to focus on rather than nickel and diming. And so you'll want to make sure that it's crystal clear. And you guys likely have all seen this, where a franchisee, the first time they get a notice of default, it's, well, you've never enforced that before. There's a new field support person who's a tougher evaluator than the prior one. So again, communication's important, teeing it up so that, for example, if we haven't required some standard before, well, beginning July 1, 2017, here is the standard that we're going to measure. And if you're not achieving the standard, here's what's going to happen if you don't meet that standard. So that's kind of the stick approach. And then the only other thought I'd have, Eric, is this, and I see this all the time. It's franchisees just don't wake up one day and decide that one day, well, I'm not going to live up to the standards. I'm not going to comply with the system. So it's often the field support people that should keep their eyes and ears open. What's going on? What's going on with a particular franchise owner? What's the backstory? And if they're not complying with the standard, ask why not? Why not? Now, maybe that's part of the franchisee. Maybe it's partly the franchisor. We need to do a better job of communicating and evaluating. So too often we just get stuck in doing it the same way we've always done it without really exploring what's going on, what's the backstory, and how might we address that. And with those conversations, then moving forward to do what we need to do, you are in a much better, stronger, healthier position.
Right. No, that's great.
Eric, let me can I just add one thing to that? So I agree that people don't like to be nickel and dime, and they kind of hate payment defaults when they're sort of immediate and close to when they defaulted. But I think part of that onboarding process and training is that the franchisor has lots of obligations, lots of issues, lots of expenses in growing and developing technology in the system and blah, blah, blah. And it depends on the royalties are the lifeblood of the system. So you need to pay them just like you need to pay for your, the people that work for you. But some expectation around it. It shouldn't be that royalties is just some amorphous thing that you do or you don't. Rent sometimes takes that form. It's just rent and I'll make it up or, whatever it is. But royalties is attached to a real obligation and a real company and real duties and liabilities, and people need to expect them. They need to know that their expectation is that they pay them as and when they're due.
Right.
Oh, absolutely agree. Completely agree with Lane. That's not negotiable, right? Not paying royalties, but it's some of the other stuff that is the nickel and diming that I was talking about, not royalties or marketing fund payments. Couldn't agree more with Lane's comment there.
Right. And Brian, you mentioned, put compliance aside. I mean, you've got, and I think Lane made a good point to differentiate between compliance and performance. I mean, there's a lot of good franchisees out there that are compliant but are struggling, and so you want to help them. You don't want to terminate them. They're trying. They're doing maybe the right things, just not getting the right results. Can you, I shouldn't say can you, or how do you offer, some relief as far as things like, maybe royalty relief or extra marketing, or, you're going to send in some extra field support, or, what do you see people doing, and by doing that, what, legal obligations or liabilities do you open yourself up to?
So a couple of thoughts, Eric. I would be very reluctant to get into this discussion of royalty relief, just for the reasons we noted, right? I think what has to occur before even any of those conversations, and I've seen it all the time where if I'm going in as a field support person, I want to make sure that franchise owner is capable and on board of making changes in their business. And that's the piece that's often stepped over, is we're getting the results. That franchise owner is getting the results that they're designed to get. And so they're going to keep getting the same results unless they change something. And just giving royalty relief isn't going to do it more often than not. Right. And so until there's a plan, and I've talked about, if we're going in to do a field support visit and we're not going to, fix everything all at once, it's incremental. Let's pick one change, and we're going to measure it. And how are we going to measure it? And so when we come back in the next quarter to do the next field support visit, what am I going to do as a field support person? And what is a franchise owner going to do as a franchise owner to directly impact whatever we've identified as what we're going to change? We're going to improve whatever it is, right? The top line, we're going to focus on customer guest service, whatever it is, we're going to identify what it is, how we're going to measure it, and what we're going to do to make a difference. And if we can't come up with that, then we better start over. That's the frustrating, I believe, for field support folks, is we keep doing the same things again and again and again without getting any measurable results. And oftentimes that's the franchise owner who's unwilling, incapable, because something else is going on, to really focus on what needs to be done to change in order to make a difference. So to me, that's way more important than royalty relief or something along those lines.
Yeah, right. Lane, how do you approach, that struggling franchisee and trying to, assist them?
So let me say this. So in what we'll pick up in our joint employer discussion, paying the expenses of a third party, like a franchisee, is something you'd probably prefer never to do, if you can avoid. Logically, I think franchisors don't really generally wake up one morning and say, I want to pay or defer or subsidize an operator's costs or expenses. So I think the rising tide is against it. Now, to Brian's point, if you think that there's a plan to rehabilitate the unit, and I like things like using that royalty abatement to increase your local advertising expenditures, or something where your unit will likely be rehabilitated or benefited, or to hire a person that you need, or whatever it might be that will ultimately solve whatever the problem is that the plan is intended to correct. I think that, we see lots of people take those amounts, whatever that is, that abatement amount, and either loan it, right? So they have a promissory note, and they sign up, and sometimes that note is forgiven over time, depending on the franchisee's level of compliance, so that if for every year of the next 5 years that you're compliant, we'll forgive 20% of the note, and that's a good hammer to try to get people to be compliant who are otherwise non-compliant. And so, you are sometimes trying to do it to bring people into compliance, right? So you're trying to create a pool of fund to bring them into a currently compliant deal, and they have some immediate cash flow issue that's going to correct itself. But I'm with Brian. It's got to be a plan. Everybody comes to you. Everybody says that there's a reason and why they can't pay all of their expenses, and you're the logical party because everybody else is a third party. But most of those folks don't have a plan on how to rehabilitate it. And to Brian's point, you really need to roll up your sleeves and figure out what's broken, whether it's the operator himself totally, or whether it's some issue that can be corrected, and that this amount of abatement will actually correct it rather than drive it further into the negative.
Right.
And of course, if you do such a thing, depending on what your relationship with the franchisee has been, these kinds of events are opportunities to get a release. And so if you have a contentious relationship with your franchisee, and I already said you don't really want to do it, but if you can get a release out of it, or toll all the issues or claims, or maybe something did happen in the past that you want to get rid of, that's a good milestone for that.
Right.
So I would just echo that last point that Lane made, and I would even emphasize it. It's any franchisee. I think it's important for if they're going to give some concession, even if it's for any franchisee, we get a release. That's just part of our amendment to the franchise agreement that's going to document the concession, and the last section of that amendment is the release. It's just the way we do things. And then the other point is, and so again, there's nothing legally that prohibits or prevents you from addressing this in a particular situation. You'll hear things like, well, we can't discriminate against franchisees, and so what we do for one, we have to do for all the rest, and that's really not the case. Yes, there are some handful of states that have anti-discrimination laws, but even under those state laws, they allow you to they say you can't treat similarly situated franchisees differently. Well, Lane and I can make the argument, as well as anybody else, that no two franchisees are similarly situated, right? So it's dealing with each particular situation. It's getting the release, but also be mindful of this. Even if you try to include a confidentiality provision in there, it likely isn't going to remain confidential. So, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that. If we're going to support a franchisee and do something, now maybe we don't get into the specifics, but we'd say, yeah, that's what we do. We look at each situation, we assess it, we put together a game plan, and it includes the franchise owner also stepping up and doing what's necessary.
Right.
I would just add, it's not only that the owners are similarly situated, but the actual opportunity or market. So that if this closure would result in you losing, a foothold in a big metropolitan market, again, I said you probably don't want to do it, but there are reasons where you might do it. And I think you could, and I think it would not be similarly situated. But we see folks try to rescue markets or market share, or save media efficiency by trying to rescue units, or try to stabilize them before they resell them to another either nearby or other operator.
Right. Let's change topics a little bit and talk about some of the legacy issues that are out there. I mean, we've got a lot of brands that are maturing. We got a lot of franchisees that are maturing. Let's start with you know, on the brand side. You know, and Lane, you had kind of mentioned this in our prep call. Franchise brands that, you know, need to invest in new technology, or, you know, whether it's a POS system or other technologies, but their franchise agreement doesn't necessarily allow for it. You know, what are some of those issues that you're seeing with franchisors that need to make a change, and, you know, but the agreement doesn't necessarily support that?
So there's two things. There's issues with the brand, and then what their prior practice was with respect to updating to a then current form of agreement. So Brian and I know lots of companies that have lots of old operators that have agreements that either say they're perpetual or renew on 20-year intervals or 100-year intervals that seem to go on forever. And of course, an agreement that was 20 years or 40 years old today will not contemplate any of the niceties like digital marketing and or the internet or any of those other things. And so you could find yourself trying to use, like we see it come up when somebody's trying to change to a uniform POS for lots of reasons, loyalty reasons, lots of reasons that help and improve gross sales. But you always, you know, you end up with people that don't want to make the investment. And if you are put it out to them, and here's the computer system, all the people on newer agreements have to buy it. You have to buy it at the same price, and you know, you can wind that out, try to convince them why it's better. And I think there's some light to be shed there. I think that being able to come in and showing how a new technology builds gross sales, builds customer loyalty, average ticket, and those kind of things are the first step in making any investment, is trying to show why it has any kind of return or why it's worthwhile. Certainly, if there are people on more recent forms of agreement that are earlier adopters, you'll have lots of data to synthesize and to try to analyze and put back to the person who's fighting with you about it. Sometimes it's an economic issue where they just don't have the money, in which case an ability to finance it with either the vendor or some other lender is advantageous. And sometimes if they're a relatively small number of holdouts and you can't get them to come on board and you want them to, we've seen people either take out the big stick or buy it for them. You know, do something where they're trying to facilitate this, maybe not buy it for them, but subsidize it, make it somehow facilitate it. And in a more contentious relationship with more claims and potential litigation, you know, releases at that juncture are highly valuable. But these are where your oldest, most mature franchise, I don't know if they're your most successful, but certainly your oldest, most mature franchisees could have validation potentially impaired as you try to take your stick out. So, and again, to an FAC or technology committee or somebody else who's franchisee based or run that can be the person trying to be more persuasive. I think there are levels and layers to it in terms of trying to bring about compliance. And then, of course, as last gas, if you often have better rights on renewal, if your agreement provides for then current renewal or remodeling upon renewal, you know, you're in a better position at that point to demand it because it's in there. And so right. You hate to wait around for that, but it depends on how much time between then and now. And of course, you can always use the tool of a resale to try to work somebody out who doesn't see the benefit of a technology-based franchise but is in one, to try to maximize the value of their exit, but to have them exit.
Right. Brian, any advice on upgrades like that where you know, the franchisor may have no strong backing in the existing franchise agreement?
Yeah, I just would add, and again, it complements what Lane said, you can't allow these legacy franchisees to hijack or hold you hostage with respect to what you need to do from a system perspective, customer demands and customer expectations. And so every franchise system has to evolve, and so you have to do it, and then that's one of the contingencies or factors in the game plan. This type of issue requires a comprehensive game plan looking at all the various pressure points. And one of those pressure points would be the legacy franchisees and how we're going to address that and deal with that. And and I echo everything that Lane said, and maybe one point of further emphasis would be, because oftentimes when a franchisor is looking at system change and system evolution, they're well advised to be very collaborative in that exercise or that endeavor, right? To include franchisees in the process. And we'll talk more about the importance of that later on, but I'm a big believer in the importance of collaboration, not just from a brand perspective and a buy-in, but it also helps eventually legally. And so if we have legacy franchisees, and you know what that might mean, that we don't agree, but we at least should have their input along the way, because I think their input is going to impact all the pressure points that Lane mentioned. But ultimately, it's either up or out with the legacy franchisees. And out can be through the legal means, or it can be through, as Lane mentioned, a franchise resale program, exit strategy. It's now, you know, if they're really mature franchisees, they may have run their life cycle. Let them exit by getting something of value for their business to get new blood in, and what we can do to accelerate that or facilitate that, like Lane mentioned, is crucial, important.
Right, right. I mean, one of the big issues that we see a lot in our surveys is, you know, around remodels, you know, or re-equipment packages that are required, and you know, a lot of, I like, Brian, that you mentioned, you know, getting the franchisees involved, because like I think back to IFA a few years ago when Cheryl Batchelder from Popeyes spoke about their brand and the remodel challenges that they had, and they had a new remodel that, you know, the ROI just wasn't there on, and they ended up scrapping the whole thing and going back to the drawing board because they hadn't involved the franchisees. And they came up with something together that was much more economical and a better end result. And so, you know,
Eric,
I mean,
just a great example of that.
Yeah.
Eric, just a great example of that would be Dairy Queen, and because many of you likely, they've got a lot of old agreements out there, 1 page, 2 page, not a lot of franchisor rights like our 30, 40 or more page agreements do now, but they needed to modernize, and they had this new grill and chill concept, and so they looked at it across the board, and in some cases it was a remodel, in other cases it was a tear down, and there were other packages too. Maybe it was just a new signage package. I mean, so you had that's one way to approach it, rather than, it's not necessarily one size fits all. But let's get creative. Let's get creative to come up with a menu of ways to get us to where we need to be as a brand, rather than it's one way or the highway, and then we get bogged down in legal issues and the like.
Right. Yeah, and obviously just timing around the agreement. I know I worked on it with a recent client that had an issue with they had a 10-year franchise agreement, but they had a 7-year re-equipment clause, and you know they had all these people coming up on that, you know, re-equipment clause, and you know they only had 2 or 3 years left in the franchise agreement, and they were being forced to, you know, invest several $100,000 in equipment when they didn't know if they were going to renew or if the franchisor was even going to renew them. So again, the timing, I know you and Lane both talk about timing of leases and timing of things like that. Do you see a lot of franchisors making missteps in those areas?
Well, with the situation you just described, a logical option, alternative, right? There's no one way of doing any of this. But what you just described, you know, why not consider an early renewal, right? If somebody's going to spend several $100,000, I get it. As a franchise owner, and we should all put ourselves in those shoes, to invest several $100,000 and maybe not be renewed in a couple of years, and then face a non-compete and do all of those things, I get it. I get
Right.
it. So let's
Right.
look for solutions to address those kinds of situations.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Lane, what do you see, you know, and you mentioned exiting franchisees, legacy franchisees, but, you know, most franchisors spend so much time, you know, thinking about getting people into their system. They're not spending a lot of time talking about succession planning and transfers and all that. I mean, do you see any best practices in those areas or tips for people here?
Yeah, so I mean, I think transfers are something that are generally invited. We like systems to be liquid, and we like people to be able to get in and out when they're, not at their whim, but when they decide that they want to exit. So in our view, that's always part of a manual. It's always described to them, obviously, and I think it's a person-by-person analysis. Of maybe you have no kids or no people to will it to. But in terms of, you know, a lot of times we see our clients precipitate those discussions when the person doesn't have the zeal for the passion for the business, or is fighting against things that we know are, you know, are going to be the way this company does business in 2016 versus how they did it in 1985. And so I think as people pop out of compliance, you're always trying to show them that transfer is an option. I think succession planning is good. We just had one thing that we just looked at recently where, like, it was all done properly in the franchisee's operating agreement in terms of trying to create a right in the partner to continue the business, and it was funded by insurance, except it wasn't funded by insurance because they forgot to buy the insurance. So, and they had also put their value, they put like probably 3 times the value of the company on there, thinking that it would just be funded by insurance, and it wasn't a real number, and it created a huge breach liability lawsuit and 7-year litigation, and still limbo in that unit. So I think if you're going to, you know, I think as you try to train people in best practices, we should try to, you know, see to it that they get appropriate advice, and that they, I mean, it's not something we can do for them. If they don't, then it will play out poorly for them, likelihood, or at least uncertain for them, or economically uncertain. But we do see people trying to, like, as the younger children or whatever get involved in the franchise business, obviously the more involved they get, the more important they are that they're bound by the franchise agreement and the obligations in it. So a lot of franchisors do reach out and try to initiate conversations about participation, those kind of things. But again, if you don't want to tell anybody to do it, as we get to the next topic, you'll see why you don't really want to be interfering in the disposition of a franchisee's shares is important, because you don't want the thing to be in limbo or managed by some receiver or executor if that's the only thing left. But anyway.
Yeah, no, that's great. And that's a great lead in, I think, to our next big topic, which is HR related issues. And there's a lot of issues here. Certainly joint employer and some of the big issues, vicarious liability around that are some of the big ones. And I just want to, first I want to remind people on the call that Brian and Lane are here to answer your questions too. So feel free to chime in any questions that you have, and we'll get them answered as best we can. And we will leave time for Q&A at the end. I guess, Brian, if you could just give us, there's probably some people on the call that don't even know what joint employer is, and may not have heard about this whole NLRB ruling thing. And can you give us a 30-second overview of what that is?
Sure. So the National Labor Relations Board, in response to getting pressure from various unions, including the SEIU, really focused on the franchise business model. And so we shouldn't lose sight of the impact or how this all started with the unions losing a foothold in their place in the world of employees, and union membership dropping. And in their view, to the extent that a franchisor is considered a joint employer with its franchisees, then it's much easier for them to gain a foothold, to collectively bargain, to have employees of all the McDonald's franchisees be members of the union rather than approach it one franchise owner at a time. And so the NLRB listened and focused on whether or not franchisors could be considered to be joint employers with their franchisees, and therefore then they're hooked into all the employment related issues that arise when an employer is not only dealing with wage and hour, but it's also dealing with union related issues. And so that notion historically, or the principle, was a franchisor would not be a joint employer if it didn't have direct control over the employment related issues, conditions at a franchise owner. And so that was the old test. The new test, and it really came up in not a franchise case, but a Browning-Ferris, which you likely all have heard of, is the new test is now direct or indirect or potential control. And so that touches really everything. And that's the great unknown. What the heck does indirect control mean? You know, as a lawyer, we would be able to say to our clients, and Lane and I have said this for years, stay out of your franchisees' employment-related matters. You know, don't get into hiring and firing matters. That's their area. Focus on everything else, but stay out of employment. And now with indirect and potential, and that's where McDonald's now is in the crosshairs of the NLRB, and will be fighting that case for years to come, because the NLRB is saying things like the technology that McDonald's required franchisees to use enables them to exert control because it focuses on the labor component of the business. Well, you know, most franchisees would say, I want my franchisor to help me control my expenses so that it helps my bottom line. And so that's that whole indirect control. And unfortunately, what is happening, and we see this all the time, it's not just the NLRB. It's not the Department of Labor. It's now the state agencies. It's private plaintiffs' lawyers. It's actually the private lawsuits that could potentially impact franchisors, where a franchisee's employee is fired or harassed, or the franchisee hasn't complied with wage and hour laws in the state of California. And so a group of those employees for that franchise owner sue the franchise owner and McDonald's, for example. So McDonald's is facing these cases on a lot of fronts, and in some respects, you know, we in franchising are the benefit of that, because McDonald's is going to fight. And so, you know, the tide might be turning a little bit, but we're not going back, at least for the short term. And so understanding the principles of joint employer, direct versus indirect, and how we handle that from a field support perspective is important to understand the pressure points.
Right, right. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, you know, I know you guys both talk a lot about, you know, just educating and around these issues, and we talked about onboarding franchisees. You know, employees obviously need to be educated and onboarded as well, and understand, you know, what that franchise relationship means. And, you know, I know just in previous presentations I've been with, you know, both of you, you know, things like, you know, the company logo, the brand logo being on the paycheck, or, you know, even, you know, uniform issues. And it's like, you know, you ask the average employee, who do you work for? And of course, they work for the brand. They don't, you know, they don't know that. So, you know, these are some big, heavy, hard to kind of understand issues. You know, certainly one of the big things that we've seen, and I know you have seen it, is franchisors have, you know, in reaction to the McDonald's case and others that were out there, did an immediate about-face in training employees, and all of a sudden just cut things off completely. So Lane, I'd like to go to you and just kind of talk about the impact you've seen this have on, your clients and, kind of the right way to do it. But before you do that, what I want to do is just put a poll question out there to the audience to whether or not training has been affected, their training within their brand has been affected by these rulings. And
you mean training and support, Eric, right? Training and support?
Training and support, training of the employee, the franchisee's employee. So how has that been impacted? Lane, what are you seeing?
I'm sorry. I thought you were waiting for the poll to come in. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay.
I think there are some lessons to come out of what we've seen so far, particularly the franchise opinions. I think that in training specifically, just to dial into that, I think now all of us are telling our clients to train, absent some kind of compelling special circumstances, is to train the franchisee and the manager and not train individual employees of the franchisee. And if, God forbid, you do, that you've actually charged money for it, which is what people do who train third parties in businesses they don't own. So I think that's been more or less a structural change. I would describe the about face was more out of fear and uncertainty. So rather than people boxing questions that come into, here's a very specific question, I should or shouldn't answer that. If it was an HR question and it involved anything to do with employment, they either said, I'll call you back in 5 minutes and didn't reply to an email or just didn't get back to you. So I don't know that anybody was making a calculated call on that. I think from Brian and my perspective, somebody, your field staff shouldn't be coming in and firing somebody and replacing them or saying they have to go, nor should they be going into a location and hiring somebody. Nobody should be changing the economic terms for what people who work there make or don't make, or becoming fully invested in it. Now, I want to add one caveat. So there are certain businesses, like in the haircutting business or the massage business, where the inventory of individual service providers is so tight in relevant markets that many franchisors have put their toe in the water or taken, maybe dive in with trying to recruit either, let's say, massage therapists or stylists for franchisees. And if you talk to those people, they say that function is so critical to the operation of the franchise business that it would materially change the business and structure if they were to change that. And so some will tell you that it's a calculated legal decision. I'm gonna absorb that liability. Some will say we don't think we have liability, making a different call on the business issue. But it's sort of an interesting caveat. Brian and I ordinarily wouldn't recommend that you do a cattle call for all of a franchisee's employees, but we both remember days when people used the word turnkey to mean just what it sounds like, that you got the keys when it was fully fit out, and we think that we probably have an issue with that today. We think that we've seen people try to articulate, instead of just the reason that you have to do something, we've seen them try to tie it to a brand standard or trademark use or trademark right, so that they can, again, tie it to their duty to supervise the use of the mark and the licensing of the mark to shepherd the uniformity and the standardization, if you will, rather than just say you have to wear a uniform and it has to be blue and it has to have 6 buttons on it. It really is that it has to, if it was a uniform requirement, that it displayed the brand marks. And then I think in this day, if your uniform says the brand on it, you'd love it to say, Fisher Enterprises or whatever your franchisee name is, and certainly if not on the uniform, on the business card or on the truck or any other stuff, the leave behinds that go for the reasons that you alluded to in the McDonald's case. And then it seems that I remember Krispy Kreme used to have issues with people trying to organize its various regional offices, and they used to have a team. First, I think it was internal, and then I think they were way ahead of this. They brought in external outside consultants that came in and worked with folks in terms of how to work with attempts to be organized. But I think that, if you read into these cases, that, coaching people or shepherding their ability to not be organized as labor is definitely going to put you in a hot seat here.
Right. Yeah, and that was one of the questions we just got related to, a third party coming in managing that piece. I mean, I know a lot of franchisors have kind of transitioned to that, where it's, the third party providing that training. I don't know to what level the franchisor could be, have a liability issue if they're providing some directive to that third party as far as what their training should include and should not include. But, I don't know. Have you seen a lot of third parties providing that training?
Well, Eric, I'll jump in for a second, and I want to make a couple of overarching comments. These are important issues. The legal pressure points shouldn't necessarily drive action and decisions. Most franchisors shouldn't have to completely disrupt their business model, their support, and the like. We're talking about what should be maybe just changes to approaches, and training might be one of those. But I think that's a good example, though. To me, using third parties to allow franchisees to get their HR and employment questions, needs addressed, absolutely. And there are organizations like ADP and others that have divisions that do that. Or if a franchisor has a franchisee association, those associations often are looking for ways to get more involved. That's one. On employment-related advice. Training, I think, is a little more hybrid. Part of it is for the reason that Lane noted. Part of it is, to me, there is a very important distinction between, we're not talking, every franchisor can enforce brand standards. Franchisees must meet brand standards. Now, not everything should be a brand standard, but and then the other piece of that is, but how they do it, this goes to Lane's point, how they do it, let's give them a recommendation. Let's give them a suggestion. More often than not, franchisees are going to follow it. But if they can skip step 6 and still meet the brand standard, have at it. So we're not talking about modifying brand standards. We can enforce those, and we should. But it's the data, it's the execution where we can look for, again, as I noted, a recommendation, a suggestion, and the like. And then the last piece on training, because I had this very conversation with a couple of franchisors. They said, Schnell, and they do regional training all over the country, 2 times a year, 8 regional stops. We're not discontinuing providing that regional training. And there are supervisors and there are managers and from franchise units that are going to be there. But we're going to focus on brand standards. We're not going to focus on HR-related areas. And I think that's okay. And what we did, though, is we had every single employee that showed up to that training sign an acknowledgement right at the get-go, right at the door, before they attended training. I acknowledge and agree that I'm an employee of, ABC franchise, not an employee of the franchisor. This training doesn't change that. It's a one-page, non-legalese form. Maybe you have every new employee with the franchisee sign that. We know some franchisors are doing that. So again, I think and again, you see this all the time. If the franchisor doesn't do it, it doesn't get done. It doesn't get done. Right. And should we have a third party do that? I don't know. I mean, maybe, but a third party isn't a stakeholder like the franchisor and the franchisee. So again, kind of navigating through that, I think, is an interesting conversation that depends on the business, depends on the industry, as Lane noted, depends on, who our franchisees are. It goes back to right from the get-go. I want the franchisee to know right from the get-go it's his or her responsibility to hire, fire, and train his employees. Might we supplement that on brand standards and the like? You know what? We might. Do we provide optional videos? Yeah. So again, looking at it in that perspective, I think will bring a little clarity as to, maybe not complete clarity, but a little more clarity on how to handle it.
Right. Yeah, no, it's obviously a balance. Go ahead, Lane.
I was just going to say that to your point before, you could still, if you're going to delegate to a third party any of these functions, obviously you have a duty to police it and make sure that they do, that they're actually doing something and doing a good job. I guess there's, this negligent selection of such a person could be out until you can shirk your responsibilities or what you might have in terms of your training obligations without having some standard for your training. But we've seen a lot of people lay some training. It's not so much the HR training, although it may bleed into that, on manufacturers or on independent institutes, like in the folks that train people to be barbers and masseuses or whatever, that have some independent business training. But I just think whoever you select needs to be otherwise competent and qualified.
Right, right.
One final thought there, Eric. One final thought is I think, and as you guys know, at the IFA Legal Symposium, I just moderated a session on some of these practical applications in the joint employment world. And I believe that every single franchisor, if they look through their ops manual and related communications, could improve how those are framed, what they say, what the end result is, and to address some of these points. Because if you read the cases, the facts matter. And so historically, it's been, well, what does the franchise agreement say? Well, yeah, we can add 5 or 6 provisions on what the franchise agreement says. That's important. Ops manual, similarly. But how you address some of these other areas and how you frame it up and how it's communicated to the franchisees, again, reading the cases, in almost every single case, those things matter, and it goes beyond the agreement and it goes beyond ops manual. Or, for example, and then I'll shut up, ops manual. A lot of franchisors right now, they're all available electronically, and so in the old day it was 1 3-ring binder with hundreds and hundreds of pages. Now it doesn't need to be. It's often a suite of manuals. There should be a brand standards manual that includes the you musts, and then it might be a series of other manuals that are more recommendations, more suggestions, more pictures, right? They're just worded and framed and outlined differently than they were 10 years ago. Take advantage of that opportunity to address some of these issues.
Let me jump in on that for a second. So there is what we've seen, I think, same as Brian's experience. There are certain language in some of our old ops manuals and franchise agreements that are just terribly damning when we go look at them. They stick out like a sore thumb. Some are harder to find and are more difficult, but some are throbbing sore thumbs. So there is some need to sanitize the things that are clearly problematic, but then, as Brian says, tie things out to brand standards whenever you can. Have a million acknowledgments that you're not, who the franchisee is and who you are and who you work for and who's going to do what. But to a comment that we made early on, it doesn't matter what your writings say. If in practice your support people go out there and hire and fire everybody and do things that are completely inconsistent with the writing. So it is really a top-down teaching of, hopefully you get it right and it's in your legal documents and your disclosure documents, but the training of your people really just to stay in their lane and know when they can and can't do it, and maybe if that involves them not doing something they used to do, having some communication around that. But that this in practice is where I think people are going to really get jackpotted, because I think that people think that if they get their paperwork in order that they're good, as opposed to making sure that all the new field and assistant field and anybody out there might blow it for you.
Right, right. One of the questions that came in related to, and I can't remember which one of you said it, as far as training the franchisee and managers and letting them train the employees. The question specific about whether they should charge franchise owners to train managers, or if that's okay, if it's okay to train the manager and then let them train the other employees.
I think we both probably said it. I mean, I think it depends on what you've committed to for your initial fee in the franchise agreement. Most of those go to your franchisee and a manager, or up to some number of people. And most of them provide for additional refresher training or new employee training or video training at some cost. But again, if you can deliver to the franchisee some, let's say, video type instruction where they could ultimately offer and train their people with it, as a tool, that might be helpful.
Right, right.
And I think the fee, to Lane's point, you can go either way. I think as it relates to these joint employment related pressure points, the fee is maybe relevant, but much more relevant is all the other stuff that we've talked about. Framing the issues, including the right language, getting employees, including managers, to sign these acknowledgments. That stuff is way more critical than whether you charge a fee or not.
Right. And one other question that came in, I mean, when we looked at that poll, basically a third of the audience said that they had pulled back significantly from training, and another third said they'd pulled back some. So 2/3 have obviously, more than 2/3 have adjusted their training. Is it, you know, and you know, the sense I'm saying is that, you know, for the most part, what you're, you know, really you don't have to make a big adjustment. But if you are making adjustments, there was a question about should you mention or explain to franchisees that this is in response to the NLRB issues, and or should you just say we're making this change and not really get into explaining why?
I think you may not want to go into all the details, but I think you absolutely should explain why. And I think you also should be prepared to answer the argument, well then why am I paying royalties? What am I getting in return? If I'm getting less training support, how, you know, what's the exchange there? And not that you need it legally, I'm not suggesting that. But again, you guys are living in the real world, and the real world is some franchisees know about this, most don't. And so to help educate them, we all have heard Aziz Hashim talk about the importance of he wants his employees to know that they're employed by him and his organization and not Popeyes, even though he's proud to be part of Popeyes or whatever franchise system he's involved in. And so again, it goes back to that clear understanding of what we're doing and why, and then how that impacts the roles and responsibilities of each. And so if we're going to do less on training, then we better, in my view, articulate but we are doing more on the brand or whatever. Again, it's unique to each system, but I think you absolutely have to have conversations and transparency as to what's going on.
Right, right. I know we're...
Go ahead, Lee. If the costs are modest or if the costs are high, it may, right, so if you pay a certain amount of royalties, say it's $100 a month, and now we're telling you to use an outsourced person for certain functions that cost $98 a month, people might feel like you're not earning, depending on what else you were doing for the fee. So I think the more in order of magnitude that it grows, the more that you need, that question will come up and might even be a good question at some point. And I think we're seeing it is coming up, but it's more, I've heard people, because to say, look, we don't want to provide these services to you because we're afraid of having a big liability against us, doesn't buy you much goodwill or love, but it really is a best practice to respect these bright lines between that exist in franchising and not elsewhere, that requires us to adapt our business model to a changing thing. And mostly, you know, a lot of this independent contractor, you know, employee stuff is out of the Uber and all these FedEx and all these other walks of life that aren't us, but that people are aware of. So, but you're not going to get a lot of love saying we just want to avoid liability. You're going to have to package that in some way, and find, maybe you'll have to use some of your royalties to subsidize the third party or something. I don't know, Brian, we haven't even talked about whether you could do that or whether that puts you in the hot seat, depending on what else you're doing. But it depends on order of magnitude is the only comment I have.
Right. And another quick question that just came in too, and a lot of people use third parties to do their audits of stores, brand standards. This specific brand talked about enforcing brand standards as well as food safety. Because that's a third party that's monitoring that, is there any other special issues they need to be aware of around that?
You want that, Brian?
Either one of you can jump on that.
I mean, I think having an independent person do the food safety is intelligent to me. It all is a matter of what it costs and who's paying for it. I think that having a third party come in and terminate you for failure, or issue some pronouncement that you're in breach or violation sounds awfully attenuated to me. I'd rather those people come in and supplement what I'm doing rather than be outcome determinative with the relationship itself. But food safety seems like a great objective way to come in and say, hey, your temperature was off in your walk-in box, and no one will dispute the finding of a third party. Now, if you have somebody competent who's doing the field testing that is from the refrigeration business or has been doing this a long time, you may be able to establish the same kind of credibility there.
Right.
Right, and I think, Lane, you mentioned it earlier. You better make darn sure that who's ever doing that is qualified and is an expert. And so I don't think offboarding this and utilizing third parties is it goes back to, it depends on the system, it depends on the brand. It might be part of the solution, but that's why it really takes a overarching conversation about all the different pressure points and the support we provide. And my whole view is I want to make sure the right people are doing the right things. And so if that's our team, then I want our team doing it. And some of that is, it goes back to the point Steve Aronson made at the IFA Legal Symposium, and he's the GC O'Rourke Capital, and they have, I think he said now, 50-some franchise investments. He said, this isn't about eliminating risk. This is about balancing risk. And that's what executives do all the time. And that's the way we lawyers, again, we outline all the pressure points and where the guardrails are and the like, but it's about balancing risk. If you're focused on minimizing risk, your brand's going to suffer, and you're going to have challenges beyond. You might not face the joint employment lawsuit, but that's the good news. And the bad news is you're going to struggle in a lot of different other areas, in part saying, franchisees saying, what the heck are you guys doing for us then?
Right, exactly. Well, and that's a great lead-in. I want to jump to our last topic. You guys both just came from the Legal Symposium. Obviously NLRB is one of these external forces. There's all sorts of regulation that franchisors face, both in their own industry as well as in franchising as a whole. Lane, what are you seeing as kind of the big kind of items on the horizon right now that people may or may not be aware of?
Thanks, Eric. So what we hear people talking about in a sort of bewildered sense is that we're now looking down the barrel of accounting changes put out by the Financial Accounting Standards Board that change the income recognition rules applicable to franchises, so that it's clear that in 2019, when a private company sells a franchise for a 10-year term, that franchisor will only be able to recognize 1/10 of that initial fee in the first year, and a straight line method until the end of the term, unless the agreement is terminated earlier. Let's say it's terminated in year 3, in which case you can recognize all that income. But any company that goes through a point in their existence where they can only represent 10% of their income, or they have a loss of income recognition of 90%, is going to have challenges with an audited financial statement, because the audited financial statement is always monitoring your capital and working capital and net worth. And one thing that chisels that away is a liability equal to whatever the remaining term of your franchise is. So the liability would be up to $80,000 carried forward in the second year, is going to come up on your balance sheet as a negative, which is going to impair your financials. And depending on how many other sold but not open units you have, people could find themselves with pretty dramatically affected financials, which we think will translate into hiccups in the registration process and more companies having some sort of financial accommodation or requiring mid-stage capital events early on, or recaps, to try to change the equity, right? Because we can't borrow the money to fix it, because that only makes the problem worse. But you need to either trigger an earlier stage equity investment and or otherwise find some way to deal with it. If people are used to selling 10 packs for 10 a year, you can see that the same rule will apply to development agreements in areas in terms of what you can recognize. And the day of the 20 pack or 30 pack, I think is gone, because I don't think that there'll be enough money up front to pay commissions or whatever your upfront expenses might be on that. So this financial change to the accounting standards is a big deal. It will affect public companies in 2018 and then private companies in 2019. Apparently there was a comment period that there wasn't a lot of activity on the accounting side, and I think that everybody was more focused on the public company disclosures. But it's a big deal. So that's the thing we talk about most, Eric, is this likely outcome related to it. I don't know, you want Brian to talk about the NASA stuff, or you want me to?
Sure, Brian, you want to talk about item 19 changes?
Sure. I think and to Lane's point on this FASB issue, I think that we in franchising, including the IFA, is getting a late start on the conversation, because a lot of times something like this gets fairly far along the process, and it had an unintended consequence of hitting franchisors like the way that Lane described. But I think one of the and Lane, I know on the IFA board, you guys have talked about this and are putting resources in place to make sure we're, from an IFA perspective and franchisor members, having conversations to see what, if anything, might be done to address some of the issues that you identified, right? Isn't that one of the priorities of at least some of the people on the board?
Yep. There's like you said, there's a lot of action now, but really much more on putting the word out and being able to go actually change it. At least from our perspective, there's lots of folks talking about it. There was a meeting held at the SEC last Friday that my partner Joe Dunn attended with others and other lawyers and folks from IFA. But I think to Brian's point of a late start, I think people need to be thinking about how they'll likely deal with it and what changes to their own business model or sales practices might be where they need to end up, and how that might change compensation, Brian, right? I mean, every bonus calculation in the world is a function of recognizing of income which is recognized, or so it's bound to change lots of things for lots of people.
And just briefly on item 19, Eric, and then I know we want to leave a little time for any final questions, but item 19, for several years, NASA has been working on what they call their item 19 financial performance representations commentary, and it's gone through, I think 2 drafts, and I don't think it's final yet, but in talking to people that have been involved in it, it's close, and we've kind of seen what it likely will look like in its final form, and there are changes, and so and we likely and Lane, you likely saw those too, or we were more proactive in already trying to address some of the pressure points rather than waiting to get comments from state examiners, because we know the states this year had the ability to choose and pick which new requirements they wanted to focus on, and so they've been doing that. So we're kind of living under the new item 19 regime, but it's, and most lawyers wouldn't agree with all of it, but by and large, I think it's a recognition of more information that is reasonable, that can be backed up, that prospective franchisees should be able to rely on. That's all good, and so it's requiring franchisors to be more mindful of that. It's requiring franchisors, for example, little things like, if you're including averages of revenues and the like, you have to include medians to take into account any skewing of especially emerging systems. To one that we have seen for years, and we see it often in franchise promotional materials, it's, some subset focusing on the top 20%. Well, now the rules in item 19 say if you're going to include the top 20, you better include the bottom 20. And a number of franchisors have done that in the past, but now that's just the way we do things. It's taking into account that if you have franchise locations open for more than a year and you're including some item 19 information on company locations, you got to include franchise locations as well, so that if your franchise locations aren't performing as well as company and you're going to rely on company, prospective franchisees should know that. So it's those types of leaving out lots of the details, but working with your lawyer to understand how that will be rolled out next year, even more so than this year, it's important.
Well, just to jump in on that, so I think that, the old rule was you could say anything you wanted to say as long as it was true and you stated your material assumptions and you had a reasonable basis. And lots of folks, either following our lead, Brian, or running with it, have gone to set out their highly efficient units and those other things as the thing they want to talk about most. And so it's, this is bound to change the way folks present their data. And I would also point out both this item 19 change and the accounting change will disproportionately affect emerging, newer, growing, quick-growing brands because they're going to eat up capital faster. They're going to have a smaller data subset to be able to draw these other highly efficient conclusions from, and have to include a lot more negative data than they've been required to include already. So what we've recommended to folks is that they take a look at what they have now, run it by somebody like Brian or me or somebody to say, hey, what kind of facelift is this going to need when this thing becomes final? And get a sense of what that is, because if it's completely a rewrite in the trash, then you're back to the drawing board. It also may require you to collect more data, which may require you to either go out with surveys or your POS or other information that you may not already have, or you may need to get in place as we creep up to this. But it's a big deal for emerging brands.
Yeah. The one piece that has been most frustrating in a couple of situations in my experience is this new rule, if you will, that because we lawyers have drafted footnotes, right? And I believe they've often been helpful. They've been explanations. They've been important for a prospective franchisee to understand what the numbers mean and what they don't mean. And now the rule is you can't have any disclaimers. Well, what the heck's a disclaimer, right? And so some examiners are saying, boy, you can only have 3 sentences. Well, I'm going, but all this other stuff is, well, we're not trying to hide the ball. We're not trying to hide behind it. We want candidates to understand it. So we've said, well, how are we going to get that information that now can't be in item 19 someplace else? Because I want prospects to understand what's in the numbers and what's not.
Right. I know we're running at the very end of our time limit here, and I want to ask anybody that's got questions to stay on, and we can try and address a few if we can. I also just want to, obviously there's so many issues out there, and I just want to talk about, how do you, if I work for a franchise brand, what are some of the best sources for keeping our staff educated and trained on these issues up to speed? I mean, obviously, consulting with your attorneys is critically important. What other resources are available to folks that want to keep up to snuff? Brian, you want to share with us some of those?
Well, I think the IFA is really increased its game, improved its game, moved its game to the next level when it comes to education and training. I'm a member of the ICFE board, and so I personally believe for field support, operations, and the like, getting involved in the CFE program and some of the field consultant focused programs, it's important. And some of it's online, some of it's at the IFA convention, some of it is going to Lane's Springboard Conference. We do the Faegre BD Franchise Summit. There are opportunities for you all to network, and that's the best. right? Getting into environments where you're talking to other people that are facing some of the same challenges and opportunities, nothing better. And so it's convincing whoever's writing the checks for you to go to events, you know, and oftentimes it doesn't have to, you don't have to spend a lot of money and be efficient. That's what I would recommend.
I totally echo those comments completely. I think FranGuard IFA's course is available online and is an easy place, an inexpensive place to start. I see there's lots of executives that are on this, look like matriculating for their CFE, but that's actually a, you know, that's the right step. I hope you're all getting credit for this. At our Springboard event, we offer the FranGuard session, but to Brian's point, it's just being around people who are a lot and way ahead of you in the food chain is what brings the curve up. Involving as many of your folks that are senior level managers in these kinds of opportunities, getting some breadth in your organization is critically important. Education is a thing. Brian and I, we just got back, and we still do it. And Brian's got 30 years, got a couple more than me. But you know, the point is that this is a rapidly evolving area of the law, as you can see from the topics that have come up today, and you can easily be behind the 8 ball. And so Brian's advice and your advice to pursue educational opportunities like this is the starting place.
Awesome. Well, I know we're running late here. I want to have Mike give us an update on our next session. And if anybody else has any last-minute questions they want to chime in, we'll get Lane and Brian to answer those as well.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. I think we've done a pretty good job of working in the questions that came into our conversation. I don't have anything in the queue right now. If anybody has any last-second questions, now is the time. But short of that, I do want to thank everybody for joining us today. I just chatted out a link to a quick feedback survey. Hopefully you guys can just let us know how we did today and what you thought of the content. The next session is this Thursday coming up at 2 p.m. Eastern on delivering a customer experience that sets your brand apart. So we look forward to seeing you all there, and I just want to say thank you again to Elaine and Brian for taking some time out of their day. We really appreciate your time, gentlemen.
Always fun to work with Brian.
Absolutely. More than happy to do
it. Thanks so much, you guys.
All right, guys. All right. Thank you. Thanks everybody.
Bye-bye. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.